Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on the key principles of the Second Vatican Council, today's Do You Know question is, do you know why Vatican II insisted on the principle of the reformability of the Church? Before the Second Vatican Council, and for a long time, Catholics believed that the Church was pure and holy, a divine institution that could do no wrong. It was pure, holy, without spot or wrinkle. And as a result, even though individual members of the Church could sin, the Church could do no wrong. And many Catholics grew up with this. However, in the actual renewal with regards to an historical critical studies of both the Church and history, we proceeded to look more objectively and more critically to the history of the Church itself, and we began to realize that the Church did do wrong, did many things that were sinful, that there were times that she went completely off track. Not just its individual members, but the Church as an institution went off track. And so the Church had not been faithful to its call and its mission. And Catholics began to be aware of that. Vatican II essentially became aware of that, the participants of the Second Vatican Council, and especially as they evoked the biblical image of the Church as the people of God. And as people of God, in covenant relationship with God, the Church did do wrong. In its attempt to be faithful, yes, but it did go off track at times. And as they looked at Church history, you began to see it in a more objective level. And therefore, the Church, people began to realize that the Church had done a variety of things. For example, it had burned heretics. It had persecuted Jews. It declared wars in God's name. It established inquisitions which tortured and murdered people. It contributed to many of the divisions and dissensions that occurred among Christians and so on. As a result of this awareness, Vatican II affirmed this basic principle of the reformability of the Church. In other words, the Church always in need of continual reform and reformation. Now, of course, reform and reformation was really very suspicious since the Protestant Reformation. It was not held in high esteem by the Church, and yet Vatican II, as it looked at its history and so on, became very much aware that this is what the Church needed. And I'd like to share two quotes from the Second Vatican Council that really affirm this principle in a very strong way. One is from the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, its Latin name referred to as Lumen Gentium. And number 8 of the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church states this, that the Church, however, clasping sinners to its bosom, at once holy and always in need of purification, follows constantly the path of penance and renewal. Obviously affirming the fact that the Church is always in need of penance, reformation, and renewal. Another very strong quote comes from the decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, number 6. And I'd like to quote from that decree. The decree says that Christ summons the Church as she goes on her pilgrim way to that continual reformation of which she always has need, insofar as she is a human institution here on earth. So both quotes actually affirm this principle, and it was a principle that ran through all of the Vatican II documents. With this principle and with this awareness, Catholics were now free to actually look at their history and admit that there were times that we did wrong and begin to disavow those things. A good principle to really hold in mind is the fact that when we look at history, when we look at the institutions, within there's both good and bad. with regards to the bad, we have to acknowledge the bad, ask forgiveness for this, and commit ourselves to do better. With regards to the good, we have to acknowledge the good and continue to build on that good. And therefore, as we acknowledge the good and the bad, there's always the problem of looking at the whole principle with some sort of discretion. And what I mean by this is that not everything was bad. There are many good things that the church has done throughout its history and continues to do through its history. But, you know, at its best, the church, in its core, the inner core, especially in its scripture and its sacramental life and liturgy and so on, is always aimed towards against evil and always aimed towards doing good and building up the reign of God in our midst. And therefore, this is at its core the principle of the church doing good, and yet at the same time the awareness that the church has done some things that are wrong and we need to disavow that. So that along with its own individual members, the church is always on a path of renewal of reformation, has to continually look at itself and examine itself so that it can redirect itself to continue to build the reign of God on earth. So ultimately, the saving hope for the church, which is divinely instituted and yet still a human institution, is that God's grace has been freely gifted to it. And God's grace is more powerful than any human sinfulness and any human error. And therefore, the church builds its hope and maintains its hope by relying on God's grace and continually turning to God's grace as it guides it along the way, the Spirit's presence guiding the church along the way so that it can be in a constant state of renewal and reform. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of why Vatican II insisted on the principle of the reformability of the Church, and I hope we will return again as we continue to explore the key principles of the Second Vatican Council. Thank you very much.